All right, we're going to go. If anyone decides to come, I guess they can catch up. It's not going to be fast and furious. Yeah, thanks for being here and for, you know, hopefully this looked interesting enough. The title of this presentation is Security and Privacy for the Modern Era. I kind of wrestled with that a lot because it sounds like I'm going to give all of the answers to security and privacy. You know, a lot of times we don't talk about privacy so much, but security and privacy are really closely related. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But the second part of this second title is Architecture and Design, Thinking Beyond Technology to Protect the Business and our Customers. I've been to a lot of different conferences, RSA and Raleigh, and this one multiple times. And I always go to those conferences and I hear a lot about technology. I hear a lot about the things we should be putting on our network. A lot of seminars are sponsored by vendors, people who are selling things, and those people, they all have really fantastic ideas. You know, I get, you know, machine learning and automation, all this stuff. You hear about all these things, and it kind of blows your mind what's possible now. But on the other hand, given the role that I have, which I'll tell you about in just a second, I want to hear a lot of times about what other companies are doing to secure everything from the top down. How are you doing it? And sometimes if you don't hear how other people are doing it, or if you don't see a comprehensive view, you wonder if you're doing things right. And I like to be validated in the decisions that I make. And so I thought this presentation, while it's, you know, it may not do that, it may give you an idea of how I see things and what I see as being really important for securing a corporation, especially if you go across borders and all that kind of stuff. So this is Thinking Beyond Technology. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. My title that they put here actually changed recently within the past 2 weeks or so. I started out on desktop support. I've been at Volvo for 13 years. I started out on desktop support there, quickly moved to server infrastructure, was doing VMware and Windows and storage and networking and all that stuff. Moved over into security because of Sarbanes-Oxley mainly. I was responsible for the audits and making sure we were in compliance and all that kind of stuff. And of course, there's a lot of security controls and all that, and got to know that. Eventually moved into infrastructure security, handling firewalls and proxies and IDS and IPS and all that kind of stuff. So I've kind of done the infrastructure thing. And then in the past 6 or 7 years, I kind of moved over to more of an architectural role. And you're going to see there's a theme to this presentation about architecture. Because at first I really didn't, I thought it was a bad idea in terms of the stuff that I was doing. And then as I've gone along over the years, I see a lot of value in architecture and doing it very well. So you're going to see that thread woven through here. So essentially where I am now, I lead enterprise and cybersecurity in Volvo Financial Services. VFS is the finance arm, kind of like General Motors financing or GE Capital. You know, it's a captive finance, which means we only finance our products in the Volvo Group. Volvo Group is roughly 100,000 people in 200 different countries. We sell trucks and construction equipment, buses, boat engines, all that kind of stuff. So we finance, and we're in 49 countries in VFS. My new role now is enterprise and cybersecurity. So it's not just information security, it's all enterprise security. Could be premises security, could be you know, anything. And I also am, because of my technology background, there's a focus on cybersecurity. And even though it's not in my title, I'm still responsible for privacy governance on the IT side. I don't sit in IT anymore. I sit in legal and compliance. So I report to the senior vice president of legal. When that's just very new. I've always been in IT, so this is actually going to be kind of a neat experience, I think, to see things from the outside. As I mentioned, I've been in information security for 13 years, and the past 3 or 4 years, I've been leading the IT privacy area. So not always the business processes, and but more on the IT control and compliance side, let me put it that way. Have a lot of experience with GDPR and recently CCPA, moving into LGPD, which is privacy in Brazil, and South Africa has some stuff too. So, all right. So one of the things I want to mention about this presentation, like I said before, this is really from like a 10,000 foot view. Like I said, this is not about technology. It's not about how we're going to secure specific applications or specific things. This is how in your company can you make the best decisions for security. And obviously it's from my perspective, but also, yeah. So let's start. Where are we? When we know these things intuitively, we live them day in and day out. But I think a lot of these privacy regulations in particular, and some of the new security regulations that are coming out in specific places, kind of highlight the fact we have big data, we have unlimited compute essentially, between Azure and Google Cloud and all of these different kind of things, AWS. As much compute as you want is available to you, and that can be good and it can be bad. Of course, malicious actors, hackers, they can take advantage of that. But it's not just that. It's that from a privacy perspective, the company itself could be a problem. If we don't have good practices inside our company, we could be putting people's personal data in danger and not even know it, or it could be used in the wrong way and we wouldn't even know it. So while outside actors are definitely a huge problem, sometimes we're our own worst enemies. If we're talking about data science and machine learning, robotic process automation, all this kind of stuff, do you always know what these things are doing with the data you have? And so what we need to do really is build privacy into our business processes, build security into our business processes. This all needs to be integrated, and we all know this intuitively, but this presentation is really about maybe things that I've learned to help move those things in the right direction. One of the points on this slide is good security supports the ability to provide privacy. If you don't know the history of GDPR or where that came from, or if you're not too familiar with GDPR, it's a privacy regulation that covers all of Europe. But the point of GDPR is to prevent something from like World War II from happening again. If someone can use your personal data against you, they could coerce you or influence you in a bad way, and maybe get control over you that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. So, and here in the United States, that makes a lot of sense to us too. We haven't had that happen to us, thank goodness, but I think that makes sense to us. And with the amount of data that's collected by companies, you think of Google is in all sorts of antitrust lawsuits in the EU, and big advertising firms and this kind of stuff, being able to ad tracking, which is what CCPA is all about. Some of this stuff makes a lot of sense. All right, so we kind of have this understanding. I wanted to talk a little bit about the business environment. Like I say, when I go to these conferences and I see technology, a lot of times the idea is that if you buy our new widget, our new tool, our new technology, if you use machine learning, if you can see every packet that's going on your network, all of a sudden you're going to be secure. And I think we all know that there's a lot of value in that, but it is limited. It doesn't cover everything. So what about your employees? How do your employees move data around? They're legitimate users. They have access in a lot of circumstances, and you may have good access controls in place, but what environment is our business in that from a security perspective can have a big influence on whether our data is actually secure or not. So I've listed 5 major areas. You see none of these involve IT systems. IT systems obviously is a part of this, but I kind of want to look outside the systems. If we were looking at how from your executive's perspective they see things, this is kind of what I'm thinking about. So first category is risk tolerance. This was mentioned in one of the earlier keynotes, I think, but depending on how much risk your company is willing to take will absolutely have an influence on the security program and privacy program that you build. If your company is willing to take a lot of risk, then you might not have a very robust security program because they see it as being the cost of doing business. So banks, for example, or financial services institutions generally have a lower risk tolerance. So you're going to see a lot more security there because the problems that could come up are a lot greater. I put on here executive personality. I don't have cable TV, but if I see it, if it's on CNBC or something, they always have CEO of GE or CEO of this company or that company, and their personalities actually absolutely has an influence on how security is done in a company. So you can't just say, we have a budget, we're going to go do this thing, when the CEO could change that at any given point in time. Shareholder expectations are along the same lines. If they want every last penny out of the company, then they're probably not going to be willing to spend a bunch of money on security and privacy. They want you to do it very, very efficiently, which means you may have to do without some things. Legal requirements obviously has an influence on how you do security and privacy. That basically, in these regards, you're forced. You have to do it this way if you're going to operate in a particular market. So we have regulations, cross-border data transfers. If you saw recently, the new Privacy Shield was invalidated by the European Court of Justice. That just happened last week, and basically that means that technically EU personal data isn't supposed to be under Privacy Shield, isn't supposed to be transferred to the United States. So for a company like Volvo, where my company in VFS is headquartered here in Greensboro, we're in 28 markets in the EU. So there are ways to do it with standard contractual clauses and all this kind of stuff, but that just means you need to pay attention to that. You need to know. You can't just disregard it. Litigation and legal holds is a big thing, especially in terms of GDPR and in terms of security. You may have to retain some data because there's a legal hold on it, because there's an investigation going on into your company for a long period of time. How are you going to secure that data even when nobody else is using it and it's sitting on a system somewhere in the corner that nobody accesses anymore? It makes a big difference because there still could be critical data in there. Another factor is workforce. I put company culture. Some companies have a culture of working hard, being there before work starts and after work ends, and people are tired and they want to take shortcuts. That could have, some are very relaxed. I think about Silicon Valley companies. I think everybody there works very hard, but it's generally pretty relaxed most of the time. I take that back. Yeah, that's probably not true. In any case, are the majority of your employees white collar? Are they blue collar? Are they skilled or unskilled? Volvo is essentially a manufacturing company, so we have a lot of blue collar workers that may be using shared terminals, shared workstations, shared computers. That has an effect on how you do security. There's a lot of influences and factors. And then, of course, with the whole COVID thing, so many of us are working from home now. And, I've attended webinars, you probably have too, where you see how much is changing in terms of working from home. Location, business customs, geographic influences, all that kind of stuff. One of the things I've learned in working in this company is that you can go in one place and do things one way and go in another and have to do things completely the other way because the culture there just won't support it if you do it the way you want to do it all over the world. That there are some conflicts there, and that can have an influence. Industry sector makes a big difference. I just mentioned, we're a manufacturing company. My part of the company is financial services, but are you local or international? What kind of innovation do you do? Is it all on paper, or are you doing innovation in products, or how does that all work? Product security can be a very big thing. One of the earlier presenters talked about IoT devices. Those are innovative devices that usually don't have a lot of security in them, but does that mean they shouldn't, or what influence does that have on the overall security of your own company? That can have something to do with it. Partners and suppliers is a big one. One of the things I do on a very regular basis is evaluate suppliers for security. We have a lot of companies have entire GRC departments that handle that kind of thing. So this is just an overview of where we are, what things to consider when you're considering how security should be run in your company. And even if you're in, I wanted to mention this, even if you're in a more technical role right now, if you're like I was 10 years ago, where you're managing firewall, or you're looking at proxy logs or IDS and IPS, or you're doing more advanced stuff, you're in the SOC and you're doing threat detection, all this kind of stuff. I think all this information is still valuable to you. If I back then knew what I knew now, I absolutely think that a lot of my decisions would have been maybe not made differently, but I think I would have had a better understanding or purpose in what I did. And that's a big reason for this presentation, is because if you're analyzing logs on a day in, day out basis, and then something changes or something comes down from the executive team and you're wondering why, you can maybe have a better understanding of why things are happening the way they are, all the different possibilities that are influencing those decisions, why budgets are how they are, and all that kind of stuff. Let's talk about privacy for a second. I think in this particular conference, I don't know if there are any other presentations about privacy. I'm not going to get into it in detail. I've done GDPR presentations before, but I want to give you a decent high-level overview of how I think things should be done in privacy, just at a high global level. And I say that because, of course, I mentioned before, we have these different privacy regulations. We have GDPR, we have LGPD, we have CCPA, which is a different animal. But you know, if there's a common denominator among all of these things, and what I have on these slides, or this slide here, is kind of the common denominators. If you do all of these things well, or contemplate them, or put them into some sort of practice, you're going to be covered for all of these regulations and requirements, and be a good stewardship of people's personal data anyway. So the first category I have is data governance. I would say, and I don't know, I haven't worked in other companies recently to be able to say this for sure. I read reports, I look at things online about how other companies do things. I think as a general rule, because so many companies have grown organically, meaning that they started out small, they added systems as time went on, they didn't have a lot of money for big time development or couldn't buy a big application off the shelf. Our data has kind of grown organically too, and the stewardship of that data isn't very good in a lot of circumstances. So what does that mean? That basically means that we have a lot of systems, and in our companies we have a lot of systems that have redundant or duplicate personal data. So you may have one system that is your system for sales and that kind of thing that has customer data in it, and then you have another system that is related to user preferences. You may have a system that's related to payments. You may have all these different types of systems, and your user data is in all of them, and it could be inaccurate in all of them. And I think a lot of times, unless you're close to the people who are managing the data, or unless you have a data governance program, we don't even realize all of it's there until we have to integrate, and then the developers tell us that we're going to have a major problem. So what does this have to do with privacy? Well, if you have all of this data in all these different systems, it's really hard to keep track of. And so some regulations like GDPR require a data catalog. That means you have to have a list of all of those systems and all of the different types of personal data that's in them. And you have to be able to reference it and keep it up to date, and it's got to be available to authorities. So if the authorities come in and want to see where all your personal data is, you can show it and share that with them. But this makes a lot of sense just from developing a program too, because how do you secure it? And this is one of the big things about in this cybersecurity framework, identify is the first category. This is essentially that, right? There are also these other ideas that go along with data privacy. Minimal collection. This is more of a business or a process restriction, but in IT, we have to help the business understand this too. Sorry, if you don't need to be collecting someone's birthday, it's just not necessary for whatever the transaction is you're doing. Don't ask for it if it's not necessary. Lawyers should be helping with this. This is called data minimization, and this helps in a lot of different ways. If you don't have it, it's not necessary to have a lot of good security on it, and because it's just not even there. I put on here master data. If you don't know what that is, master data essentially is where you have one golden copy of personal data, and then it's shared between the systems. That way, if something needs to change or needs to be updated, you change it in one spot, and they all get updated all at the same time. This is something that I think is some companies are more mature at than others, and if you do this well, this will help the privacy program along a lot. I've heard of some scenarios where some companies do master data very, very well, and implementing a privacy program is pretty simple. I put on here retention policies also under governance. Basically, that means that you get rid of the data you don't need when you're done. And I can tell you that if you're talking about financial planning and analysis, people who are looking at how the company's going to run, they've looked at it the last 30 years, they look at all the historical data, they want to look and make analysis of how it's going to run in the next 5 or 10 years. They want everything. They don't care what it is, and they will ask for it forever. But you have to be able to convince them that, first of all, it's not always legal to do that. And second of all, it's in their best interest in a lot of ways to at least anonymize it somehow. I have that in the privacy by design column. I'll talk about that in a second. But be saying that our retention policy is for this type of data, a specific type of data. Say it's a credit score or something like this. After 3 years, it's gone. it needs to go away. And you just build that into your business processes. If it's not, like I said, if it's not there, then it's not a risk to you. The second category is data subject rights. I put access modification. This is part of GDPR too, but CCPA also has some of this. Basically, as a data subject, I'm giving you permission to hold on to my personal data when I start a deal or a transaction with you, whatever it is, if I'm buying something from you. But these regulations say that I actually own the data, and I have to be able to exercise some control over that. So if I want to know what you have on me, you have to be able to tell me. If it's wrong and I want you to update it and fix it, then you have to be able to do that too. But if you think in terms of master data, what I was just talking about in terms of over collecting data, which is what we've done for a really long time, do you know where all the instances are? If someone wants to know what you have, can you go find it? I've been involved in this for a few years now and trying to figure out these processes. They're really, really hard, especially as the company gets larger and as it's grown over time. Same thing with deletion or portability. Portability means you give them a copy of the data, and they can take it to someone else if they want to, or they just get a copy if they want to see what you have. But in any case, one of the things that's really hard is if you have 5 or 6 systems that a customer goes into when you do that deal with them, the transaction, sell them something, whatever, do you know who to go to, who can get it out? Is a system capable of doing that thing you need it to be able to do? And that can be really challenging. Do you know who's responsible for the system and who has a capability to do that in the system? This is where all the third column, privacy by design, comes in. I put security as the first thing in privacy by design. You know, the GDPR says you have to have security commensurate with your ability to provide it. Essentially, that means if you're a big company and you have a lot of money, then you shouldn't cheap out on security. You need to be able to do it well. So privacy by design means that in your applications, in your infrastructure, in your perimeter, in all these different things that we talk about in security, in the way you collect and use data, the reason you're collecting the data, all that stuff needs to be designed well with privacy in mind. And security goes a long way in that. You know, how are your systems set up to make sure that the data doesn't get stolen or changed inadvertently or on purpose? The second thing is something maybe most people haven't heard of: legal grounds of processing. Legal grounds processing basically means what legal right do you have to collect that data and to do anything with it. The most common ways that we're used to thinking of are notification or consent. Consent being when you go on a website, there's a box that pops up, says we use cookies, we're collecting data about you, and how here's how we use the data on you, and here's what you can do if you don't want us to have it anymore. That's consent. I'm giving you my consent to process my data. I click the OK box and everything's good. But part of the problem is that consent sometimes can seem coerced. If you think about employment situations, for example, when I go to work for a company, if I want to work for that company, I have to give them certain types of data. Maybe my birthday, my bank account number, if I want to be paid by direct deposit, all this kind of stuff. If I want the company to keep working with me well, then I have to give them my consent. So is that legitimate? Yeah, not really. There are other reasons. There could be one of the legal grounds is performance of a contract. So, for example, if someone in a data subject rights scenario comes and says, I want you to delete my data because I don't have my personal data anymore, but you still have a business relationship with that person, you don't have to delete it. Sorry, I can't comply. Why? Because I need to maintain this contract I have with you. So knowing and understanding all of that stuff in order to design your applications, your systems, your processes properly is really important. I put IT general controls also. This means, do you have a set of standard controls that your applications have to meet? They have to do all of these things. Like maybe you have to have this type of authentication mechanism on every application, or your data is encrypted in every application. These are a general control that is applicable to all of your applications all the time. And this is the kind of thing where some HIPAA and Sarbanes-Oxley and PCI, they do this kind of thing. You may use a subset of those frameworks as to IT general controls, but that's a way to help with privacy by design. And then finally, I put data obfuscation. It's sort of like minimal collection. Minimal collection means you just don't have it. But if there's a way to hide it or cover it up or make it so that people can't see it if they get into your system, for example, using tokenization, where you have a token in your database in place of the real data, and you have a master database somewhere else that's highly secured. Or in your test systems, if you can mask the data or change it with some dummy data and that kind of stuff, that's a good way to help move towards privacy by design too. Let's talk about security for a second. So that was privacy. Security architecture, and I use the term architecture because I really think that, well, let me explain architecture first. Architecture really has to do with, a lot of times when we hear the term architecture, we think of infrastructure. Do we have firewalls in the perimeter? Do we have network segmentation with firewalls between them? Do we have IDS and IPS, scanning packets at various places around the network? Do we have software-defined networking that can modify things on the fly? How does all this work? Now, a lot of times we hear architecture and we're thinking, physical devices or a network that may be virtual, but that's not really all. That's only a piece of the picture. Architecture really is about supporting this, and this is from my perspective, how we do this the right way. But architecture has to do with fulfilling business capabilities. How do you fulfill business capabilities? How do you make the business capabilities secure? This can have to do with infrastructure for sure. It has a lot to do with infrastructure, but it also has to do with do you have business owners assigned for applications, people who are responsible for the applications? Are they doing reviews of who can get into the applications? There's so many different ways, and architecture is also about thinking into the future. It's a huge part of architecture. When we're here in the present, the business will say, I need to be able to do this capability like yesterday. We have a competitor, he's doing this thing. We really want to be able to do this thing better than he does, and we need it yesterday. Okay, that's great, but do we have in our existing security organization, do we have the capabilities to support that new thing and not have it screw up everything else in our entire environment or cause some enormous risk that we don't foresee now but could be a big risk in the future? So this is about thinking in the future, from a security perspective, how are we going to support this? I would say right now, security architecture, and I mentioned this in kind of the sub-headline up there, cloud services and architecting cloud services is a really big deal in our businesses right now. Everybody's moving to Office 365, we're using AWS, we're using Azure, we're using a lot of different identity and access management things. How do we architect so that we don't really mess up things in the future? We don't have a giant problem that causes us headaches when we move down the line. I can tell you firsthand that this is a really big deal, and it can cause a lot of enormous headaches. And the other piece I mentioned before was work from home. Somebody on one of the previous webinars, one of the keynotes mentioned doing split tunneling, how that can cause problems. A lot of companies just threw up VPNs in a hurry. Maybe with split tunneling enabled, even if you're split tunneling, do you have the ability to look for data going in and out of your? It is possible to do it, even if you're not bringing everything into your corporate network. So that's the architecture piece. We have to think through all of that. There's a group called the Open Group, and they have this architecture framework commonly referred to as TOGAF. This is usually used by enterprise architects. Enterprise architects are these guys who do this, but for all enterprise applications and for the business. TOGAF has security requirements and a chapter about security in it. So, if you want to know more about architecture and security and architecture and not missing anything and using a good framework to make sure everything is there, TOGAF is a good place to do that. I put 4 different high-level areas on this slide: design requirements, identity management. I want to talk about each one just for a second. This is obviously not exhaustive. There's a lot of things that aren't in here, but I wanted to just mention these specific things because I think from a corporate perspective, from a really high-level perspective, they can have a big influence on how you design security. And when I say design security, obviously it has an influence on infrastructure. It has an influence on applications and the choices you use in applications. It has an influence on cloud choices and that kind of thing. I put design requirements. Usually when you're talking about design requirements, you're talking about the project team doing the like an RFC, some sort of proposal from a company, or a piece of software you want to use. We have on-premises, we have cloud. What does that mean? We have functional and non-functional requirements, right? Security and privacy are generally non-functional requirements. And I can tell you in my experience, project teams, especially if they want to move very quickly, a lot of times the non-functional requirements don't get very much headroom or leeway in what requirements are actually put in. This is where a good architect can help you though, because architects are looking at this stuff all the time. But the non-functional requirements, and one of the earlier presenters was talking about this too, about how you know, their company had to go in and completely re-architect or redo a cloud solution, cloud application. The company went and threw it in, and there was nothing secure about it at all. They basically had to tear it all the way down and start from scratch and build it back up with good security. This is where having good security requirements up front is going to help save you in the long run, and is part of good architecture. And you know, you may not have those. The architecture is that those requirements aren't just for that cloud solution; they're for everything in your company. You have good security requirements across the enterprise. So when there's a design requirements come up, and you are making these non-functional requirements, they're built in. They're built into how your company does things. I put identity management mainly because I think in terms of cloud, and I'm thinking a lot about cloud right now, because the way I see it more and more, especially with people working from home, you know, it's going to become bigger and bigger. I know, you know, my company just moved to Office 365 last year. A lot of companies have been on Office 365 or G Suite for quite some time. I think the big corporations has taken a lot longer. But how do you let people into your applications? Are you using federations? Are you using some identity provider externally? If you're a Microsoft shop, are you using Azure AD as your repository for identities? How is all that working? And do your customers need to have multiple accounts to get in multiple systems? Can they use the same account across everything? If that's the case, how are you securing that? How are you using that? How's all that working? That's system architecture too, and it's really, really important. A lot for usability of the application, but also for security. You know, how fast can you shut down an account that's been compromised, for example? I put MFA on there. So many places are requiring that now, and if you have a good architecture for your identity management and access control management, MFA is going to come right along with it. I can tell you that some providers are easier to deal with in the cloud than others. Salesforce has a multi-factor, but you usually have to use their app. It'd be great if they could use, you know, Microsoft Authenticator, Google Authenticator or something, but it's not like that yet. Maybe someday. So all of that are design requirements or architecture questions too, because you know, you may end up in a pickle where you can't, you know, you find yourself in a bind. A user has to have 3 different authenticator apps. That wouldn't be good. I put integrations on here because I've personally ran into this. This is an enormous headache, especially in big companies and probably a lot of smaller companies, for even, you know, really small shops. If you have things talking to one another, you know, building out APIs, having a good API strategy is going to be really, really important for a lot of companies now, because like I said in the very first slide, we have so much big data, we have so much compute that everybody has huge amounts of data. How do you get in and out from systems? How do you have the systems? How do you have your general ledger talking with other systems that are for expenses, for example? How do you have all these things, especially when some are in the cloud and some are on premises? You know, it gets to be very challenging, especially back in the olden days. And I say olden days, and that's like 15 years ago. It's not that long ago, maybe 10 years ago. Back in the olden days, we just had point-to-point integrations. So now we have brokers. We have people who sit in between. We have there are a lot of companies out there on the cloud that will help you broker integration connections and replace your legacy integrations. There are lots of on-premises tools, you know, in your data center can help you do synchronous and asynchronous integrations, all this kind of stuff. And but this is a really big part of security architecture, because how are your APIs set up? You know, do you have a gateway in front that will say only this IP can get in, or how are you going to handle all that? Because those are huge places that can be exploited by malicious actors. And finally, the detection and response. You know, with cloud, with moving to home, are you able to detect if a cloud instance gets hacked or compromised somehow? If you have databases, SQL databases in Azure Cloud, for example, are the logs feeding back into a SIM for your security operations center? You know, I haven't really heard a lot of people in any of these webinars talk about that a lot. And, we can use Azure's built-in security controls or Amazon's built-in security controls, which they have a lot of really good ones. I mean, they do a really nice job with security in those cloud hosting or Google or Rackspace, these different things. But are you going to rely on them to notify you and tell you that there's been a problem, or are you going to feed it in so you can do correlation? And as more and more of your stuff moves into the cloud and off premises, how are you going to know? How are you going to correlate those things if you don't have those logs fed into your SIM and your security operations center? These are just things to think about. You also have to think about reporting requirements, mainly because in the privacy side, if we think about GDPR, for example, if we find out we have a breach, we have a limited amount of time to notify the data protection authorities. They have to be able to come in. We have to be able to give them a lot of details. You may have to notify customers. Here in North Carolina, for example, there was, I don't think it's not been passed yet, but there was some law in the North Carolina legislature saying that you had to notify customers within 72 hours if you found out there was a data breach. So that's fast. And in a lot of situations, it may take you weeks to even determine that data has been leaked. I've been part of a lot of scenarios where there was some malicious software, some malware or something, or some ransomware got on somebody's computer, and it took a really long time to figure out if any data had actually been taken. And that's a really hard thing to say we're going to report within 72 hours when it could take you 3 weeks to figure out if anything's even happened. So being able to detect things and definitively say what's going on very, very quickly is a really big deal. And so, especially in terms of these regulations. So that's something that needs to be considered and contemplated on a corporate level. If we only throw $1,000 at a cheap SIM and one part-time guy is looking at it and everything's on the cloud, that it may not satisfy whatever your requirements are in terms of your risk tolerance. All right. I also wanted to mention a few key relationships in your company, and these relationships are true really if you're, like I said, if you're an analyst sitting in a SOC looking at logs. You're probably not going to be talking to the executive team, but you should know who they are, and you should have some idea about what their personalities are like, or what things they want to see out of the security area, just so that you can do a good job in what you're doing. I have 3 categories: the business, communications and training, and government. The business, obviously businesses are run by executive teams. They have a lot of influence over how security and privacy are implemented within the company. And I mentioned before that the tone and tenor of the top executives are going to set how things are done. So just having an understanding of that, if a personality is to be very restrictive, if the company president is very restrictive and doesn't want to spend a lot of money, then when the budget comes in under, you're not going to be surprised by that. I think a lot of times, we kind of sit there and we're really frustrated or bothered because the budget is so low, and we don't understand why, and it's really hard for us, and it's hard for me because you said, the security needs to be better. We should be making investments and all this stuff, but if you don't know how these people are, what the other context is, it can look probably worse than it actually is. Like I say, I sit in legal and compliance now, so my job is to make the requirements, to do the governance and oversight, and then to provide those to security area and IT, and then they are the implementation arm. But legal and compliance can be your very best friend in a lot of ways. The lawyers are probably more worried about stuff than we are. I mean, it's hard to say that, and you can't even think it's true given all the pressure that security people can be under. But they're looking out for the viability of the company in terms of that we don't want to have people suing us because data was lost and we didn't know it and it sat there for a year. They want to make sure that we have good relationships with our vendors and suppliers and that we don't have any risk there. They want to make sure all of our contracts with people or with vendors and suppliers, third parties, are all airtight. So they have the same goals that we do, and they want to make sure that we're following the laws. And so having a good relationship with lawyers, especially if you have a lawyer who's assigned to IT, some companies have that. It's good to get to know that person and to understand what kind of things you can bring to him or her and questions you can ask and to develop that. With the GDPR stuff, I kind of had to do that, and it's been really, really good. So legal and compliance can be a really good friend. Corporate risk, or any kind of risk person, a lot of times when you're talking about corporate risk, you're talking about risk to the company in terms of the business. If we make this business decision and it's a stupid move, it can really cost us a bunch of money. Or in the case of my company, we have credit risk because we loan money to people, and we want to make sure we make really good decisions on that. But more and more corporate risks, including IT risk and information security risk and all that kind of stuff. And the people who are good at corporate risk, who are heading that stuff up, they pay a lot of attention to this. And it's more and more in the media, they're going to be your best friends too, and they can help absolutely drive and push your agenda if you get to know them and you're on the same page about stuff. I put digital IT. I guess digital IT technically isn't in the business. It's not part of the business. It's separate from the business and the supporting area. But most of us sit in IT. But knowing how our IT area operates can be really important too. If you're, like I say, even if you're the head of IT, or if you're new to IT and you're on desktop support like I was, if you get to know how the business functions and operates, you get to know all the different pieces of the business, that's going to be a huge thing for you, and it's going to help in so many ways when you're trying to implement security. Just become a friend to people. That's kind of a point. Become a friend to the IT people, the developers, the sysadmin people, all the different people. Become a friend to them. They'll be your ally. Communications and training. I'll talk more about this in a minute on the next slide, which is the last one, by the way. I think we're making good time. Put your messages in as many places as possible. And this kind of goes away from technical or systems or security and more into how we treat our employees, how we work with our employees and the people who are our colleagues in the company. They really, I'll expand on this in a second, but they really want to do a good job. They really want to, most all of them, and there are probably some bad apples who just don't like any kind of restrictions on them, but they really want to help out. And so if you let them know how to do that, then they will, and they can be really good friends and colleagues too with all this stuff. I have really tried in my role to help people understand. If they send me a phishing email, for example, help them understand we have a system where they can report that, but I'm not going to just say, hey, bozo, go and report that, leave me alone. No, here's what this looks like. Take a few extra seconds to explain to them what the phishing, what makes it a phishing email, where the danger is in it, what the risk is, and how they can avoid it in the future. And you start to get a reputation for being somebody who's really helpful, and they will come to you more, and they'll pass the information along, and then they'll do a really good job of security for you. And train people to know how to do the right thing. This is what I'm saying. When they have one-on-one contact with you, or in training sessions or whatever, we just need to be putting this out there. It needs to be in front of them. I am not a fan of overdoing it. I'm not a big fear, uncertainty, or doubt kind of guy. Some people use that to their advantage. I don't really like to use it too much myself. I like to be very factual because I don't like to be the boy who cried wolf. I don't want to say something, have it come back to bite me later. I'd rather have the facts speak for themselves. But I think it's good through various channels to get this stuff in front of people on a regular basis. And then finally, in the government, data protection authorities, that's mainly in Europe, but of course, in the United States, we have states attorneys general, in government, and knowing regulators, knowing law enforcement, knowing regulatory bodies will help you a lot. I can tell you that in Europe, one person who used to work for me in the privacy area, she had a really good relationship with data privacy or data protection authorities in various European countries. She would just send them an email if we didn't understand something, which is very common in data privacy right now, and everything is not spelled out yet. But if we didn't understand something, she would just email her contacts in these different places, and they would come back to her and tell her exactly how they saw it. And it could be one way in one country and another way in another country. But developing those relationships will help you out a lot. And if you're not doing that, if you're not knowing who your local FBI agent is, who's in charge of cyber, or if you're not knowing and understanding who different people are in your area, then you're kind of doing yourself a disservice. FBI is willing to come, and they'll have a special agent come in and talk to your executive team and explain things to them, for example. All right, I'm going to move on because I only have 4 minutes. So this is the last slide. So we're almost there. So how do we prepare for the future? Enterprise security and privacy mindset shift. This is basically my summary and what my take on all of this stuff is. I've kind of given you a really high level corporate security, enterprise security view of things. So here are my 3 big takeaways. Plan for the long game. This is why architecture is so important. Everything is moving so fast. We're collecting so much data. Everything is just going. And if we're going to secure our data, we need to try to figure out 10 years down the road where we're going to be. And that could be in terms of how the company is organized, how things are done at an application level, how your infrastructure looks. One of my points on here is think of this from an architect's perspective and use a framework. NIST, COBIT, from ISACA, they're good frameworks. If you want to use the technical one, use the SANSYS Top 20. There are all sorts of frameworks out there that you can use. I think NIST is kind of really building up a head of steam, but don't do it on your own. You can make it up if you want to, but these are already there, and they do a good job of keeping everything organized for you. One of the points here is reduce complexity. Like I said, we have so much data moving around, especially in integrations. If you can push an agenda to reduce complexity, MDM, Master Data Management, is a good example of that. If you can have your personal data all only in one place, you're going to save yourself a lot of trouble in a few years. It's really going to make a big difference. Point number 2, expect minimal resources. It kind of was a mixed feelings of including this in this presentation because it seems like a downer. We should hope for more resources. We should hope. I thought it was interesting, the keynote at lunchtime, from Palo Alto, that guy basically said, automate. We only have 9 guys on our 9 people on our incident response team. I think he said, or security operations center maybe. But automate and focus on, that's a big part of it, focusing on the real risks. One of the things that I'm not big on either, I like the technology stuff, but unless there's a really good purpose for it, I think it's an expense and a cost that we don't need to do. So for example, in my estimation, obviously spear phishing is the biggest way malware gets onto our networks. We know that. So we can put a lot of money and time and effort in looking for the signatures of that traffic going around the networks, which we should in some circumstances, but where should most of the resources be put? Probably in keeping those phishing emails from getting to our people in the first place, or having our people know and understand how to get rid of how to recognize the phishing emails, and all this kind of stuff. We have to get creative. We're not going to, especially with the move to the cloud, I can tell you, at least from my perspective and my experience, I think moving to the cloud is fantastic, but usually what it means is that the people who are giving you the money think that they can do more with less, and especially in the economy. The economy, I think, is doing okay, but there's all these thoughts of recession and maintain recession, the business cycles, and all this kind of stuff. People right now have tightened the belts a lot, so I think it's just coming to expecting that we're not going to have as much as we want to. It's going to change our mindset and how we do security in companies and how we move forward. Reuse regulations to your advantage. It sounds bad, but like I said before, legal can be your very best friend. They can say, hey, we have these regulations, so we need to do this thing, and we need budget to do them, and they can say that on your behalf, and you don't even have to make the argument. So if that thing's there, then you can say, hey, in this country we need to do it. Why don't we roll that out to the rest of the company? It won't be that much more expense, and we'll improve things all over the place. The last thing is teach your people. I said this before, people don't intuitively know security concepts. They without exposure, they know even less about privacy. And in my experience, they really do want to know, and they want to do a good job, and they want to help you out, and they want to feel like they're contributing to the company. They want to feel like they're contributing to good security. Most people don't just blow it off. So keep it in front of them. They need to be your biggest asset. They'll help you all along the way. They'll report things to you, and they will tell you when things are happening that none of your systems will tell you. So they notice things. They notice things all the time. So make people your biggest asset. All right, that is the last slide. Here's my contact information. If you have any interest in contacting me, there's a space for questions. I know time is up, but if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in there. Is there anything? Nope. All right, well, I appreciate you joining us. I think this has been recorded, so maybe some people will watch it later on, but I hope you all have a good afternoon.